Good evening, everybody. Thank you for coming out on a rainy night. It is my first time in Miami. I'm really happy to be here. And I'm going to start my talk with this text by Wayne Kostenbaum that the writer Alex Bennett brought to my attention. And it's about drawing. And the structure of my talk is really about how the work is conceptualized from its references and its material. So I'm going to read this from Wayne. The need to sacralize pathetic, erotic errands. The need to produce and not produce simultaneously. The need to verify or disguise an internal fantasy by giving it visual form. The need to draw the non-existent into actuality. Drawing grows disoriented, loses contact with its supervisors. That amnesiac form lacks the intelligence or the ordinariness to remain accountable to its master. I felt like that text really summarizes why drawing's so important to me in my practice, because it's always kind of one step ahead of painting, or I'm a little bit more subconscious when I'm drawing. And I keep sketchbooks that kind of operate like diaries or test sites for work. And this is the drawing that was the first kind of moment that became the work that now lives here in Miami, called Man Book Mirror. And this is a view of my studio. I work a lot in pastel and ink and graphite in the drawings. I try to keep the material very humble in a way so that I'm not kind of putting undue pressure on myself to create a serious artwork so that I can discover something. And this drawing was made as a direct kind of response or copy almost of this painting by Yanis Sarukis, a Greek painter who was openly gay working in the mid-century who I'm enamored with. So I wanted to just kind of show you those three images all side by side to show you that that's really how a lot of my work comes to be. It's sort of a dialogue I have with art history, with things that I can't stop thinking about, can't look away from, and then reinterpreting it as it applies to my own life. In this case, my own living space, the people around me, or the things that I own. Also in this painting, there's this image of the Radiator Building by O'Keeffe, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about references I have from American art history later in the talk, but I just wanted to point that out in case you're seeing the painting and you're wondering what the heck that little scribbled object is in the book. I've also kind of structured the talk with paintings immediately followed by the images that I felt helped me make them. So I wanted to read you a text from this poet, Jack Spicer, who was working in the 50s in San Francisco. He was not really part of the Beat generation, but someone who interested me as someone who also kind of repurposed those who came before him to make his own voice. So I'm going to read this text from his book, After Lorca. The dead are notoriously hard to satisfy. Mr. Spicer's mixture may please his contemporary audience, or may, and this is more probably lead him to write better poetry of his own. But I'm strongly reminded as I survey this curious amalgam of a cartoon published in an American museum while I was visiting your country in New York. The cartoon shows a gravestone on which were inscribed the words, "Here lies an officer and a gentleman." The caption below it read, "I wonder how they happen to be buried in the same grave. Federico Garcia Lorca, outside Granada, October." So this is a text written by Spicer in the voice of Lorca, who died several decades before Spicer wrote the book. And I think that I feel real kinship with this kind of humor and reverence at the same time, and almost a kind of erotic undertone to wanting to sort of lie in the same grave as those who came before you, as a way of opening a dialogue to gay men who came before me and trying to figure out why it was they made the images they made. The next couple images are some references that are maybe a little bit less on the surface, that are specific to the painting that's here now. This is by Paul Nash. It's called Landscape of Bleached Objects. And I was interested in that kind of unresolved quality of the forms that are not quite abstracted. They feel observed, but you can't really place them, that ended up becoming the shoulder, or the way that I described the contours in the body of the man in this painting. And of course, Picasso is sort of like a big cloud over all my work that I have to acknowledge at the beginning of my lectures or talks, because he's kind of unescapable. I sort of think about Picasso, though, as having been such a huge figure in the history of figurative art that he's almost like the grammar or something, that it's not necessarily like a reference as specific as someone like Paul Nash, but someone who you really have to deal with in a certain way. This is the painting installed in my show at Sycamore Jenkins last October. I wanted to show it in its installation because I also choose carefully the kinds of works that are next to certain paintings, and it was important to me to put this painting of Fish Market next to the painting of the male figure. Alice Neal said that she thought that people and objects are different, which is true, and that they should be painted differently. But I take a different approach. I think that I have a more democratizing view of the natural world, and I think that I want to expand the way my work is interpreted by these kind of specific hangs and show the comparisons between my representation of the male figure and other things found in the natural world. These repetitions of gradients and shapes that are found in other things that I paint. And here I wanted to show that I also work not just from art history or from my sketchbooks, but also photos that I'm taking constantly, as we all do, on my phone, and using them to try to give the paintings a feeling of real observed detail, like these sort of yellow signs that you see in the Fish Market painting. So that's a big part of my practice, that I'm constantly kind of going through my phone to jog my own memory. Not so much that the work is from photography, but that I really use it as like an aid in that way. So that's all about Man Book Mirror, and now I'm going to start at the beginning of what I consider my mature practice, which kind of happened in 2013. I had a really excellent professor at MICA. I went to school in Baltimore, named Jo Smale. And she noticed that my drawing vocabulary was really different than the paintings I made that were trying to be photorealistic or were trying to capture the likeness of somebody so much so that they sort of got in their own way. And so she helped me start to paint just from my drawings, and this was sort of the first painting I made just from my own drawing, which I started to let go, worrying about whether or not the figures really looked like my siblings in this case, or my parents, but could sort of, almost like a caricature, display characteristics of them that were significant to me, like my sister's kind of curly hair in the bottom, or my mom's long hands, something like that. So this is a painting of my family, and I also wanted to open with this painting to show that I really don't feel that the content of my work has changed a lot, even if the vocabulary or the way I interact with the material has, that it's always sort of stayed a constant, that it's the people in my life that are closest to me. This is another one from school. And at this point in my development as a painter, I was really interested in how, in moments of emotional intensity, we latch on to objects and sort of imbue them with an anthropomorphic quality, which kind of relates to what I was talking about with Neal, where even though obviously a wadded up piece of like gum wrapper or a keychain are not people, in these moments that we experience alongside them, they become avatars for that or something. And I think painting them and looking at them is a way of exploring that very real thing. And this one is from the next year. I included this painting because I feel like this one demonstrates my obvious interest in Dana Schutz. I'm going to start talking about my influences as I go on, but her ability to play with the shape of the human figure and the sort of awkwardness or the clumsiness of the human figure I found really interesting. So I just wanted to show those two side by side, that I was really thinking about those paintings that were being made And then I moved to Berlin, and it was really lucky for me. I was able to just paint full-time in a studio, and nobody was really asking me about my work, which was kind of a blessing in some ways because I started to scale the work down a lot. These couple paintings from school were quite big. I think in school I wanted to sort of prove that I was working really hard, and then I was able to kind of scale them down and really focus on the surface. But I started thinking a lot about, also I came out in college, I moved to Berlin and started thinking about the male figure a lot, and specifically about artists who were gay men, and so generating content through that research. You know, Hockney obviously is somebody who's interested me for a long time and continues to. And as I was making the small scale work and developing the surface, I think I also kind of came into my own and kind of compositional vocabulary, letting the figure really dominate the composition and spread out to the corners of the composition, which I think this painting exemplifies pretty well. And I was really thinking about painting the place, wanting the paintings to feel like they represented the place that they were made. This is a painting of one of the canals there. And then I moved to New York, and I was still making small-scale work because I didn't have a studio, starting to go to a lot of the museums here, and repurposing some of the things I saw. This painting is actually oil and collage that I made after seeing some of William Johnson's work, which is cut paper and oil. So that was a really special time for me. I was not able to be a full-time painter at the time, but was seeing a ton of work, and I was also making a lot of animations on small pieces of paper. Jobs I had, finding new kind of content in animation. And it was a nice way to kind of streamline my drawing practice and find what matters the most about certain drawings, because these animations demand like 30 drawings for 2 seconds of movement per se. So this was something I was focusing on in 2016. I'll show you just one more of those. And then I was really lucky to have had my first show on the Lower East Side with a gallery called Terry Goldberg. And the next couple images are from that show. And the next couple paintings I wanted to talk about how my interest in representing objects was getting a little bit more developed, that they also started to become part of the self-portrait. This one's called Self-Portrait with Picture, and the picture is one that I had made with an image of myself. So I've kind of, and I still do this now, but creating this kind of like mise en abîme situation of like objects that I've made, spaces that I live in, images of myself, to try to get to something beyond just representing myself. And I take that cue from art history also. In this painting, there's this small ceramic bowl near the figure's head that I've actually made here. And that was sort of a direct copy of this Matisse ceramic, which I saw also in New York in the Red Studio, which you can kind of see at the lower corner there. So I'm interested not just in paintings from modernism and art history compositionally, but also trying to crack into the methodology of these painters like Matisse and Picasso, and sort of taking cues from them as ways of structuring ideas for painting. This painting, this was the largest one from that show. I wanted to talk about also that I wasn't just looking at gay painters, gay figurative painters, but also gay abstract painters, and interested in kind of collecting this sort of family of gay artists that with a wide range of vocabularies and practices to try to create something that was really varied. And so these sort of dark gradients that started to characterize my work at the time came from looking a lot at Howard Hodgkin, who I was interested as a gay man, like asking questions like, what does a painting need to be understood or to be signified as made by a queer artist or a gay artist. And he interests me too because these paintings have such intimate titles such as Rain or Portrait of Someone He Knows, that they're not really just formal exercises. So for him, these are as intimate as my paintings, which also was something that really interested me. And I want to talk about this Hopper painting in relationship to this painting also that I was talking about with Howard Hodgkin, because I called it Big Tristan, because people kept kind of pointing out, they're like, he's so much bigger than in real life. Like, what's going on with that? And I think that paintings really have their own life and their own demands. And I was thinking about how there's sort of a critical take on this Hopper painting, rightly so, because it represents his wife in the 60s, at which point she was an elderly woman. And the woman here obviously looks pretty young. And I think it asks an interesting question, though, about the duty of a painting, or who's being represented, that maybe it could also be a representation of desire or memory, that it's not really about a moment in time like a photograph is, or a flattened moment, but a moment that contains projection and memory and hope. So that's my maybe problematic positive read of the Hopper decision to represent his wife that way. This was another painting from that show. I included this called A Breeze because it came from a film still from the Decameron by Pasolini. I like to watch movies. I watch a ton of movies. And I'm interested in Pasolini also as a character from gay history. And so this is a way I work, where I'm often taking film stills, drawing from them, and then painting from them, so that there's this kind of game of telephone from the movie to the painting. And this is a painting also from that show that I felt I wanted to include because it's an image of my family, and that's something that the painting I showed from 2013, I've constantly been painting, and I'm interested in trying to show the more erotic imagery or the imagery of myself or my partner with or next to my family, to try to create this idea or this philosophy that these two things belong together, even if throughout history or the way we talk about like a gay experience is sort of separate from our past, our youth, wanting to reconcile that through painting in a certain way. I also became really interested in physique photography from the 50s, that there was this kind of innocence, this feeling of innocence to that work that was being made. They had to be exchanged through the mail. It was not legal to, but there was something about them that was so charming that I was really interested in. So a lot of my work from 2018, 2019 was me just kind of directly copying photography that I found online or collected, and interested in people who collected that work. This one I couldn't track down the photo, but I remembered that it was from that I had seen a photograph from the 50s that it was of a kind of nape of a man's neck, where I was really interested in just the quality of the hair on the neck, and that was sort of the entry point for the painting. Similarly, so for this one, but then I translate the figure to either be myself or have a rug that I own or tulips that I bought to try to bring it into my real world. So these paintings, even though they're talked about as being very honest or very direct, are also sort of partially the fantastic, because they have roots in images of people I'll never know, people that existed decades before me. I included this painting because I wanted to talk about also how I was developing the material. I started to work wet into wet. Like I said before with the text from Wayne Kostenbaum, the drawing I really feel like is the thing that drives my entire practice, drives my discovery of new form and new language. And so I'm constantly trying to figure out how to bring more drawing into the painting. And so these paintings, I sort of just started with a layer of really, really wet paint, and then used a really thickly pigmented small brush to treat almost like a pencil and draw into the painting. So that was sort of a discovery for me. this painting was made that way also, where I love cross-hatching, I love old printmaking techniques, and trying to figure out ways of translating them into oil paint. I feel like this one's got a good example of the cross-hatching happening there. Also, these paintings are from my first show with Sigma, at which point I really felt like I hit my stride in New York. I wanted to feel at home in New York and feel romance for New York in the same way that I feel romance for the figures I was depicting. And at the time, I was lucky enough to have a studio at this residency in Dumbo. So I was really looking at the city across the East River at downtown, at the bridges, and so I started to paint them. And I think this, relates to that thing I was talking about projecting also desire, wanting to feel more happy in New York, more in love with New York by painting it. So that's what these couple paintings were about for me, of the bridges or of the Chrysler Building, and wanting also the erotic to have a real sense of place, to feel that much more real. I included this painting by Bhupen Kakar because he's a gay painter from India who I've loved for a long time, but I think that his color sensibility, these sort of nocturnal, dusky color systems, kind of creep their way into these bridge paintings. I was also really thinking about myself as a gay painter. I enjoyed a lot of support because I think the work represented gay life, and so I started doing a lot of reading. And this text is from an activist in Italy in the 70s, Mario Mieli, who wrote this amazing book called Towards a Gay Communism. I think it might actually be called Elements of a Homosexual Critique in Italian. But this painting kind of came from that investigation. I'm going to read you this text that was really important to me from that book. What in homosexuality particularly horrifies homo normalis, the policeman of the heterocapitalist system, is being fucked in the arse. And this can only mean that one of the most delicious bodily pleasures, anal intercourse, is itself a significant revolutionary force. The thing that we queens are so greatly put down for contains a large part of our subversive gay potential. I keep my treasure in my arse, but then my arse is open to everyone. And I felt like Mieli really meant everybody by that. And so that show, which had images of my family, of my home, of my environment, I think was kind of after something similar. I was trying to take instruction from him about like asserting the universality of a homosexual experience, that it's not maybe such a niche thing. And this is a still life that includes the book there, trying to kind of position that work, which was kind of crazy even for me to make, and then show it as part of something that was so quotidian, just as a fuller self-portrait in a way, that these things, having breakfast and thinking about these things, were my reality. And I called it my meal, this painting, because I was also thinking about the ways in which we sort of digest art history and can sample from it. So there's like the Morandi flowers and the Brock perspective and the Marsden Hartley torso in the collaged element there. This was also in the 2019 show called Metropolitan, of this bar near where I was living, Metropolitan. And I wanted to also create these kind of frictions between this painting and this painting of my niece. And sometimes I think that the space between these sort of paintings is actually what my work is in a certain way, that both of them represent distinct experiences, that maybe it's the third thing that is the reality of a queer existence. But I think in this painting too, I wanted to point out that I'm also always after kind of emotional roundness in a way, that I want to hit a variety of notes where, of course, this painting is kind of sexy and celebratory, and there's touch and music and heat, but then there's also these moments in between the figures of lone figures or a feeling of loneliness. So that's something I think about too, that I want the paintings always to have, I don't know if that makes sense, but like an emotional roundness to them. And then here's a Neil painting, just to show you another example of me very kind of deliberately and frankly stealing from a painter I admire. It's another painting from the SICMA show that was very large, that came from looking at imagery from the 80s of this Japanese artist, Sadao Hasegawa, who created this kind of like very voluminous kind of metallic skin that I was really interested in. And another painting from that summer, which was trying to incorporate elements from like 14th century Italian painting and O'Keeffe, and now this kind of language I developed for figures. So just a good example of the kind of varied influences I felt like I started to have under my belt. And that summer, I went to a really interesting place called Albisola in Italy, which is pretty famous for its ceramic production. Wilfredo Lam made work there, and Lucio Fontana. And I made a series of terracotta sculptures there. And I only had 6 weeks, so I sort of kept the project pretty pared down and didn't glaze anything. But I was taking a lot of cues from artists from that region in town not far away. This artist was working in the early 20th century, Arturo Martini, in terracotta, thinking about expanding my vocabulary into the three-dimensional. And also was referencing with this piece Saturday another Italian artist who actually has a lot of work all over New York City named Constantino Nivola. So my method of kind of redigesting art history, extended also to the sculptural. I think it's really my favorite way of working. This is from my most recent show with SICMA, where I was just thinking about trying to find a new vantage point in a certain way of representing the figure. So I literally put myself at the bottom, from the feet up. I'm constantly trying to explore with the material, and an easy way for me to do that is try to push the content in a slightly different direction. And this one came from a kind of funny place where I was reimagining this Lautrec painting from the bottom in a certain way. And I was also thinking a lot about like who gets to represent what. I think that I sort of made a name for myself with that first show, making work that was of a certain like high-key sexual like energy, and I wanted to shift my gaze a little bit. Also, this show was made during the pandemic, so I spent a lot of time not with a lot of people and in my house and noticing the seasons changing, and I think that sort of obviously affected my work the way it affected everybody. But I was also thinking about like light as content that could belong to me as a gay artist, that's not something that's just for, someone who doesn't have this layer of an identity politic on top of what they do, that I could maybe physically move the figures out of the center of the composition and make the center of the composition be about light falling on a wall or something like that, or just doing dishes in the morning, that was an experience that belonged to me also and kind of falls within this story of a gay life. And I was also looking at a lot of still life work because I started to make a lot of still life paintings, and thinking about what makes a still life painting, what makes a still life painting good. I was looking at a lot of Matisse and his use of black, but I was also looking at, as I always do, gay painters who made still life paintings. So I was really interested in Filippo de Pisis, who was working in Italy in the 1920s, and his use of black blacks and his representation of fish, and just trying to figure that out by kind of doing it for myself. But something that struck me about De Pisis's work was really those black blacks and those white whites, which is something I was after in a lot of this work. And I was thinking about how a lot of work from art history has that sort of range of light. And I was reading Anne Carson at the time, and I'm not going to read this whole thing, but this was from her translations of Sappho, where she was talking about this concept of poikilos, which means many-colored, spotted, dappled, variegated, intricate, embroidered, inlaid, highly wrought, complicated, changeful, diverse, abstruse, ambiguous, or subtle. And I started to think about how my use of the material could correspond to the thought behind the painting, that the more varied the mark or the more varied the color, the more varied the idea behind it could be. So even if a painting was just of a kitchen counter, that if there was this kind of variegated observation, that the feeling or the thought that comes through from something so simple as what I made for breakfast could feel nuanced or subtle. And I was also looking at Marsden Hartley's still lifes a lot, in that same vein of wanting to know how gay painters throughout history responded to still life. And he was someone who was so interested in me as someone who felt really tied to a sense of place. He made a lot of these still life paintings of birds that were specific to Maine, where he was from, and he felt very proud to be from there. And I think I similarly feel that about New York, but I felt like a dead pigeon was maybe my more like representative of a New York experience. And then I started to cast my eye around on the outside world too. Like I said before, always trying to sort of reinvigorate my use of material by finding new subject matter. So this was one of the first sort of like landscape paintings I made, which started the most recent work that I've done within this past year. This was my backyard in Clinton Hill, and sort of moving through my memory of it. This painting's pretty much made entirely from memory, because I would be out there every day sort of seeing what changed or what died or what grew, and kind of luxuriating in memory through paint, which is really similar to how I make the paintings of people too, where it's sort of savoring a memory. And I started looking at different painters who also made landscape paintings, such as Stanley Spencer here. And this painting came from a love for Cedric Morris, a painter who lived with Arthur Let Haynes in the 30s, who was also a plantsman and a painter. I'll show you his work here. Interested in kind of taking flower painting out of the sort of Sunday painter genre or something, and interested in how he really understood plants and their potential to be sexual beings or frightening, things that he kind of put his blood and sweat into to grow and breed, and wanting them to feel also beautiful but monstrous or something like that. So yeah, the last show I had in Paris, these last couple paintings are all from that show. I felt like I wanted to make a landscape show because the one before was a still life show, so kind of trying out my hand at all these different kind of big genres in painting, and interested in making American painting too, like I've said before. So thinking about forms I'd seen as a kid in the Smithsonian at the National Gallery by paintings like George Catlin, these kind of soft mounded hills that sort of stuck with me from an early age. Or birds, again, specific to where I grew up. I think that developing as a painter, it's always kind of like a spiral that crosses back on itself in a weird way. It's like you feel like you're really far from where you began, and then all of a sudden you realize you're at that spot all over again. And so painting these of like gulls or this creek like behind my parents' house, it's like I find myself representing those spaces from my childhood again. And now this painting's just from the studio, it's not done. I'm gonna wrap up my talk with this unfinished painting. I feel like I'm coming back on that spiral of reintroducing what I've learned from the landscape into the figure of these like mountainous forms or the darkness, and in some of those still life paintings. And yeah, seeing where I'll go in the future. So that's a little overview of my work.
Thank you so much for all of that. We have a moment for question and answer.
How did you get into art?
I was always drawing. Yeah, I've been drawing for as long as I can remember. And even before I went to college, knew that I wanted to study painting, and luckily had parents that supported me doing that. So it wasn't always that I thought that I would be able to make a living from it, and that's been a very pleasant surprise. But yeah, I've been drawing for a really long time.
I didn't really want to say this in this kind of a forum, but I'm going to do it, which is I got a text in 2019 from a friend with an image, and it was one of your paintings. It's the night that your show opened, your 2019 show opened at Stima Jenkins. And the person texted me and said, I think you'd really like this artist. And I did like the painting a lot, and it's my partner Greg over there, and we pulled open what little we could see online of the show. And we live in upstate New York. And I got on a train the next morning and went into the city to see the show without Greg. And I said to Greg, we have to have one of these paintings. So I go down there, I walk into the gallery, every single thing I loved. And of course, as you know, the show was sold out. And a couple of things. It had a very... it had a bit of a profound effect at the end of the day when I look back, and it came to me as we were watching all of this. It was the first time, we're in our 60s too, first time as gay men that I had ever walked into a gallery and seen that kind of work being shown, overtly sexual, man-on-man painting in that kind of gallery, which is a whole thing. If you're a collector, you stratify your galleries and you can't help yourself. So in that kind of a gallery, it was all sold. So the first thing I'm thinking is, well, who are all these people that are, who how did they know, how did they find it, how did they buy it all? Of course, our own background thinking, well, you know, it has to just be a small group of homosexual men buying the art. Of course, here we are in 2019, that's not the case, but this is what we're thinking. But what it did, and the reason I didn't want to say it in public was I went back, we talked about it, and we sat down and realized that we basically had two homes full of straight painters and sculptors that we had accumulated over the prior 25 to 30 years. We had one gay artist, not conscious at all of collecting with sexuality in mind, because it's just not something we were conscious of. But it had enough of an effect on us that we have, since 2019, never bought another piece of art from other than a gay or lesbian artist. Oh. And we have been getting rid of all the rest, and it all
doing the Lord's work out here.
All came from walking into your show in 2019.
Oh, I'm happy to hear it. Thank you. Thanks. It's a nice thing to know. Yeah, I feel like the work, I mean, what you're gesturing at too, that it's at this certain level, I mean, it's not something that I'm able to really appreciate because I'm fortunate enough to live in a moment where it feels normal for me. But yeah, it's definitely nice to hear from people that remind myself, you know, that what wouldn't have been the case maybe a couple decades ago, or maybe even 1 or 2 decades ago. So I definitely feel super lucky and happy to be part of that, for sure.
I'd like to give a big thank you to Louise.
Thank you.
And thank you all for coming.